I don't like YouTube as a channel. I would say focus on Instagram. What I've seen is a lot of brands fail because they try to do YouTube and Instagram at the same time, and then neither get off the ground because they don't have kind of the time or the resources.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. Speaking of Beyond Seven Figures, today's guest has got quite a bit of experience specifically for e-commerce stores. Taking companies from 6 to 7 to then 8 figures is not something new to this particular gentleman. So it's through some cool things like meta ad campaigns, emails, optimized emails, SMS, and doing this through data-based type decision-making and growth conversations. Now look, we're talking about e-commerce here, but I want to let you know that what we're going to be talking about doesn't just apply to e-commerce. If you've got an agency, if you're in B2B, if you do services, look, if you have a web page, you got to be paying attention, because we're going to see how all of this stuff actually can apply to you. So again, this particular gentleman, he's grown from 6 to 8 figures in just a year. Think about that, 6 to 8 figures in a year. So you're going to see not only marketing strategies to get there, but then there's going to be some operational issues that we're going to have to talk about because you scaled too fast. It's why 66% of the companies that make it on the Inc. 5000 fastest growing companies list within 5 to 8 years of first getting listed will be disadvantaged as they sold, shrink in size, or go out of business because they built their business on a house of cards. Which, I must say, if you think that might be you or you have some concerns, we will offer a marketing and sales assessment over at predictableprofits.com. I do encourage you to visit predictableprofits.com to also check us out there for some additional tips and information. But then back to our guest. So we're talking about he grew from 6 to 8 figures. We're talking about how he scaled from $25,000 a month to then $90,000 per month in 90 days. Think about that, $25,000 a month to then $90,000 in 90 days. Then there's over 3 times more revenue from email and SMS. I can keep going. But rather than me going on about some of the cool stuff this gentleman is doing, I want to introduce him to you, Joe Putnam, who is the founder of Conversion Engine. Man, welcome to the show.
Charles, great to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. You know, I'm a huge fan of bringing guests to the show that can offer unique and highly valued insights to our listeners, because we don't just have any listener. We tend to attract top 7, 8 figure CEOs that are trying to figure out how to grow faster, more predictably, and then less dependent on themselves. And what's remarkable is your story of going from 6 to then 8 figures and doing it so quickly. It can happen by accident. I mean, you're on Rogan and then boom, that happens super fast. But then there are others that have a framework or roadmap that's allowing that to happen. So can we talk a little bit about like that roadmap, that framework? Like, how does that happen in your world?
Sure. I like what you mentioned about, so my agency, my team, we focus on growing e-commerce brands. But I think a lot of these lessons, they kind of apply to any kind of business and any kind of business owner. But I would say what's particularly interesting to me about this brand that you're mentioning, the one that grew from 6 to 8 figures in just 1 year, what's interesting about it is they had a lot of the pieces in place. They had the products in place, a lot of demand for their product, but they didn't quite realize how much demand there was for their growth. So they were at a certain level. They were kind of around, let's say, 100,000 a month in sales. I'm pretty happy with where they were, but they didn't realize kind of the opportunity they had to grow and kind of the amount of money that they were leaving on the table. So we were able to come in and identify and kind of measure what was going on and then give them that roadmap in order to grow. And so, yeah, happy to talk kind of more about that roadmap, but that's the most fascinating is they were very happy with where they were and really even weren't looking to grow and didn't know how much room they had to grow. So we were kind of able to bring the plan that was able to take them to the next level.
So what was the first indication to you that they had more to grow, but they didn't know it or see it at the time?
Sure. Yeah. So the main one was, and so this is for an e-commerce brand, they were getting about a 5 return on ad spend for their ads. And so a lot of people look at that and they think, hey, I'm getting a 5 return on ad spend, let's celebrate. Let's pop the champagne. This is amazing. But one of the things that I've learned in We Conversion Engine is anytime you have a high return on ad spend, That's really Facebook's way of telling you, hey, there's a lot of people want what it is that you're selling. And really what it means is you need to be spending dollars this direction. And if you don't, you're leaving money on the table because the demand is there, people want to buy, all that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of an interesting metric where, again, you can kind of get really excited about, hey, we're getting this really high ROAS, we're getting a 5 return on ad spend, we're doing really well. But I guess the way I describe it is, would you rather get a 5 ROAS and do a month in sales, or would you rather have a 2.5 ROAS and be doing $1 million a month in sales? And when you run the numbers, everybody would be rather doing $1 million a month in sales with a 2.5 ROAS. But like I said, it's kind of counterintuitive, and you can celebrate too soon if you don't come advantage of those types of numbers.
Well, and the reality is the hardest sale to make is just that first sale, right? And so if they're able to get even a 2.5 times ROAS, is that measured off of the first sale, or is that measured off of lifetime customer value?
So that's measured off of the first sale. And I think that's part of this whole equation where, again, the business owner, a couple things, he was actually worried and saying, hey, I'm worried at some point we're going to hit our head on the ceiling. And he kind of, so, this is a good thing. And are we going to, run out of runway, run out of space? But the other side of it is, like you mentioned, you also have to factor in your average order value, but you're also your lifetime value. So, you profitably acquire your first customer, but those customers come back, they buy additional products and things like that. And so again, that's where kind of the whole growth machine, we call it a conversion engine. You need to understand how all of those pieces come together and make sure that you're kind of planning for that long-term growth. And again, if you don't and you celebrate your ROAS too soon, you can actually, kind of leave money on the table by targeting the wrong metric for your ad campaigns.
Sure. And the interesting thing is everybody has a different threshold for, I don't want to say threshold for pain, though. I think I'll use that word for like a better word because, there are some people that say, look, I'm a small business owner and it's really important to me that I make a ROAS in the first 30 days. And so they're going to be limited to a lot of channels and investment opportunities that they have if they're saying, this is what I want over 30 days. But then there's other companies that say, no, we'll do it over 60 days, over 90 days, or a financial. They flew me over to their offices a few years ago because I just happened to have a couple funnels that I built that were outperforming their funnels. And so they ultimately said, what's going on? We're going to invite you up for the day and wine you and dine you. And then hopefully, we'll have some business discussion in there as well. And so one of the things that I learned in just being with Agora, and they're brilliant, masterful technicians at what they do, is they might be willing to go break even over the course of a year for that matter, and not worry about it because their lifetime customer value is so huge that they're willing to go that length. So for our listeners, right, when you think about your ROAS, the amount of money that you're investing, if your competition is saying, we want a ROAS off of 30 days, and you say, actually, you know what, we're willing to do a ROAS off of 60 days, which is twice as long as what they're looking at, but you have a strong back end, you have a strong opportunity, either with its recurring revenue, or you have a strong opportunity to just continue to upsell and whatnot. When you look at that, you're going to win in this marketplace because, as Dan Kennedy told me, one of my first earlier mentors way, way back in the day, the aim of the game is to ask yourself, how can I spend more money to acquire a client than anybody else, any of my competitors in the marketplace? So if you could do that, then you're effectively just shutting everybody else out. It's almost like what Amazon and Walmart did back in the day when Amazon was like, I'm willing to lose money for a number of years to acquire more people. That ended up eliminating a lot of their competition and turned out for them to be, hyper profitable in the end. So it's a little counterintuitive, but it is very strategic. And to your point, Joe, it's like getting people to think beyond just the, 5 ROAS, then okay, that's it. Ask better questions, get better answers, right? Like you said, well, what if we were to actually make you $1 million a month? We'll look at a 2.5 ROAS just within 30 days. Like, that's pretty damn good.
I completely agree. And I think a lot of that comes down to understanding your margins in numbers. So we have kind of some spreadsheets and projections that we use for e-commerce brands where, we'll look at, first of all, hey, what are your profit margins? And then what is your profit at different levels of scale at different levels of ROAS? And so we can show, hey, at a 5 ROAS and $100,000 a month in sales, you're doing X profit. But even if that number goes down to two, and we're doing $1 million a month in sales, and your profit is, whatever it is, 5 times higher than the original number. So it's important to really know your metrics, kind of dive into those, look at those, and understand what that looks like. But as a business owner, sometimes that's difficult to do. So, this particular business owner, like I said, he was very happy with those numbers. And then even when we got started running the ad campaigns, and we kind of walked him through it, and we said, you're leaving money on the table. It's going to be better to scale and have a lower ROAS, but more profit. But 2 or 3 months into it, I think it was 2 months in, he said, hey, we're not even getting a 4 anymore. We're not getting a 4.5 ROAS anymore. And so he was kind of, getting a little nervous and saying, hey, we're only getting a 3. We've tripled the ad spend, but we're only getting a 3. So anyway, he just, didn't quite understand it, didn't quite see it, but we kept kind of talking to him, coaching him through it. And then eventually at the end of the year, when, we did hit where we were doing, a couple 100,000 a month in ad spend and, $1 million a month in sales, he at the end of the year came back and said, hey, I'm glad you walked me through that. I understand it now. If you guys didn't help us kind of get through that, we wouldn't have really understood the difference between, kind of understanding your numbers and pushing your scale versus staying where we were. So anyway, obviously there's a lot related to that, but I just found it fascinating that as an owner, it was uncomfortable for him to kind of push scale. But once we did it and once he saw how everything came together, they were, obviously pretty happy on their end.
It's funny because right before we jumped on this podcast, one of our clients in our board of directors program, she sent me a message and she was like, so our ad spend doubled in March. We used to be spending, so small numbers compared to the numbers that you're looking at, right? She's like, we used to be spending $6,000 a month. And then we spent $12,000 a month. And, it makes me uncomfortable is that right? Now, in perspective, she's a multi-7-figure services company. When we started working together, what she made in 1 year, she now makes in 3 weeks, right? So she's continued to grow this significantly. She was so concerned about the fact that she's spending $12,000 now. And I said, but what did March look like for you? And she said it was the biggest month in company history. So wait, let's back up for a minute. You're making multiples of 6 figures a month, and you're concerned over $6,000 of additional spend. Which part am I missing right here? And much like the stock market, as I like to share with my clients, I'm like, so let's think about this for a minute. If you invested $12,000 in the stock market in March, what would your return be? Well, unfortunately, given everything going on now, it would be negative. It would be negative. And even in good times, Warren Buffett, I believe, if I remember correctly, he averaged 27% compounded over the course of all his years. He's the number one investor in the world. So if you are investing $12,000 in your business and you made more than 27%, right? So that would only be like a 1.27 ROAS, then you're beating the number one investor in the entire world. When they start putting up numbers like what you're talking about, 2.5, 5, Warren Buffett would nearly, cut off his left leg, benefit of, growing so fast. So if people have no problem throwing $12,000 in the stock market, hoping for maybe a 20% return over the course of over the year, but are hesitant about turning around and spending the amount of money on ads with a proven predictable ROAS. So there has to be that mindset shift that this is an investment and you're looking for a return. And then there's ways to amplify that. You could take that initial 12,000 in her case, and that ROAS and continue to grow it more and more by focusing again on that back end. Before we go a little bit down that rabbit hole a little more, you talk a lot about Facebook. Is that predominantly where you're finding in your world the biggest opportunities is on Facebook? Or are you sort of more omni-channel, a little bit of Google, a little bit of Facebook, a little bit of this, a little bit of that? Where do you play?
I would say I always describe myself as being channel agnostic. So, kind of, I guess the question is, where can you get the best return? For e-commerce specifically, we do focus heavily on Facebook or on Meta, which includes Instagram. And so we are seeing the best return for e-commerce brands with a mix of Google added in. So the way I describe it is if you're going to do just one, I would recommend Meta. And then if you're going to do two, I would recommend Meta and Google, and close to probably an 80-20 split between those two. And then the third one that kind of, makes sense after that would be TikTok. So those are really what I would describe as the big brands. But again, being channel agnostic, that for other business owners is, I always talk about marketing where you want to work backwards from your customer journey, and you want to think through how to find your type of business and what kind of process do they go through and where do they spend time online. So let's say like a service business, cleaning company or a plumbing company or whatever it might be, it makes sense to take some time to take a step back and say, who is our typical customer? How do they find us? So a company like that, we all know people are going straight to Google. They're obviously not going to the yellow pages anymore. They might notice something on Facebook, but if you have a plumbing problem, you're going to go to Google, and that's kind of your path for finding who you're going to work with. And so, I would have a different strategy for a plumbing company, but it all just kind of depends on what does that customer experience look like and how can you kind of plug into where customers are going to be, finding you or your competitors.
Sure. And like, I mean, for your agency alone, I mean, LinkedIn would be a significant place for your agency to continue to grow. And I don't know, maybe you found Meta to work really good for just your own agency itself. Historically, for agencies, LinkedIn is phenomenal.
Yeah, it's a great point. So you see LinkedIn is a great place to meet business owners, brand owners, things like that. Mix in some retargeting on Facebook. So if someone goes into your website, is to start seeing kind of your ads on Facebook. But for sure, yeah, LinkedIn would make a lot of sense for an agency, and other businesses it might make sense, but it really is kind of business dependent for sure.
And by the way, so there's X, I think is going to be is this silent sleeper in there. I know that right now people are judging X based on a political viewpoint because of who the founder is. But when you look at the amount of traffic that X is bringing in right now, even the people that have something against the founder, they're still using X because that's just where the most real-time conversation is happening. X is so committed to making things work that if you actually were to reach out to speak to an advertising person at X, they will work with you personally and help manage your campaigns to prove to you that they can go ahead and bring a ROAS so that you'll continue to invest. In fact, depending on when you reach out to them, when they reached out to me, they said, I'll tell you what, we'll match you dollar for dollar for 3,000 this month. So they go, you put 3,000 in, we'll put another 3,000 in, just to be able to prove to you that this works. And worst comes to worst, like, I mean, if you can't ROAS on a 3,000 on your end, 6,000 total, we're gonna have to have a different discussion. So, I mean, there's YouTube, which I'm sure you've played with. Like, there's so many. We're limited to just our imagination when it comes to this stuff. But you just said it so perfectly, Joe. Like, go where the fish are biting.
And if actually another piece of advice I would give when it comes to advertising in business is I always tell people I have seen a lot of marketing fail when you try to do too many things.
Yes.
A lot of marketing do better when you find one, two, maybe three things that work well. You kind of triple down on that, take advantage of that, and then, kind of move on. So just as an example, we've had e-commerce clients where, and it's the shiny object syndrome. And, you hear somebody over here on Twitter talking about Snapchat, and someone over here is talking about TikTok, and someone else is talking about YouTube. And before you know it, your head's spinning. We have had clients who do that, and they kind of, they're trying to be active on Pinterest and YouTube and, whatever. They're not doing any of those channels very well. And then they end up kind of not making progress. Getting back to the original case study, I think one thing to me that's really fascinating about it is, we were able to scale that an original brand from, they were, under 7 figures. So they were 6 figures to 8 figures in 11 to 12 months. And we did it entirely with Facebook ads, Google ads, email marketing, and SMS marketing. And so we weren't really doing anything on YouTube. weren't doing anything on TikTok. It was a very focused campaign. And because we hadn't hit a ceiling on those, there really wasn't a reason to kind of spread out and kind of do more things. And so I would say that strategy benefited from, kind of being focused and tripling down versus kind of trying to be active on everything. And the other side of it is it comes to things like you think social media is all similar, but Instagram is very different than YouTube, which is very different than TikTok. And so you really need to get good at kind of each of those, which takes time, it takes investment, it takes energy. So again, if I had a piece of advice to give people, it would be figure out what you want to focus on and then really triple down on that and do your best to not, get spread too thin. And at that point, you end up not doing anything well and not getting much.
I love, love, love that you said that. We've got this saying that everything works and nothing works at the same time. And it's funny because I was at this mastermind event out in California last year, I believe it was. And some brilliant folks in there. We're talking like high 7, 8. I think there were even a couple 9-figure folks in that room. And I brought my team with me. And at the end of the event, we're sitting outside. He said, I want you to think about what you just heard right there. When people stood up to talk about what was working, right? And we put that in this hand, what is working. And then when they talked about what didn't work, and we put it in this hand, what conclusion can you come to about what actually everyone in the room could agree is working? And immediately it was obvious to my team, and they said that if you canceled everything out between what worked and what didn't work, you'd be left with nothing, which is interesting. Some of the most successful entrepreneurs on the planet are saying what works and what doesn't work. But you know what they were actually saying, but they didn't use these words, but it was what they were saying when they talked about something that didn't work. Let's say it was Facebook that didn't work. What they should have said is Facebook didn't work for them. Not that Facebook doesn't work. I used to joke around and tell people that about the only thing that doesn't work that I'm pretty confident in is Yellow Pages. Until somebody reached out to me a few years ago and their primary source of business was just on Yellow Pages. It's the only advertising that they were doing. And they were mid 7 figures. And I'm going, oh my gosh, I don't even know if Yellow Pages still existed anymore. But it's like, if you spend enough time, like you're talking about, where you master a channel, you say, we're going to focus in on master this channel. You can find a way to make it work. People will give up at the very moment that they're the closest they'll ever be to success, then actually follow through. So they give up far too fast. But then one of the things that we spoke about earlier is that the decisions that you make are data-based decisions. And that's critically important because for those folks who then may say, well, we tried Facebook, didn't work. We tried Instagram, didn't work. We tried LinkedIn, didn't work, whatever it is. My hallucination is that if you go back and you say, can I see your data? The issue that we're going to find is actually in their data. Because when somebody says something like, let's pretend for a minute, they say, LinkedIn doesn't work. It's never all or nothing. If you chunk it into different compartments, you'll say, no, wait a minute. This worked, and this worked. But this part didn't work. So if you want to fix a strategy, we've got to fix this part. What have you done to fix this part? I don't know. I didn't do anything. Let's focus on this part and try to fix it. And you focus on this part, and then you realize, oh, I can make that part work. It's like, well, you're getting a lot of clicks. You're getting, your numbers match up, but your landing page isn't converting. What have you done to split test your landing page? We haven't done anything. So that's working. Your landing page isn't working.
It's interesting. And I would say across my marketing career, that's been one of the more fascinating kind of conversations I've had more than once. Where, I'll talk to different businesses and they'll say, Instagram didn't work for me, or LinkedIn didn't work for me, or Facebook ads didn't work for me. Did they not work? Or was the execution and the strategy, kind of not what you needed for what you were doing? And then it comes down to it was not executed well. And then, the results weren't there. And so you can't write it off. But I've seen that happen more than once where businesses say, ads don't work for us. But if, again, the execution or the strategy could be off, and then you kind of write off another channel. To me, one of the best ways to kind of test for that and kind of consider that is I always like to look at, kind of the most successful businesses in your category
Yeah.
and what is it that they're doing for marketing. So, you look at a company like Ridge Wallets, and I don't know how much you know about Ridge Wallets. Okay.
You mean one
Yeah.
of these?
There you go. There you go. Yeah. So they've done very well for themselves, and they've created this new type of wallet. If anybody hasn't seen them, make sure you go to Ridge's website to check them out. And they make fantastic wallets. But they built their business largely off of the back of Facebook ads, and they've grown from seven figures to over nine figures now, and they've added multiple product categories and things like that. But if you look at their marketing stack and what they have used, it's been they primarily use Facebook ads, and it's not like they built it with some kind of amazing PR strategy or whatever. So again, just the question to ask is, these businesses that are the most successful, what channels are they using? What can you learn from that? And then how can you implement that for your business versus, trying to reinvent the wheel, or maybe thinking something doesn't work for you when, really it's just kind of the execution that was off or the strategy that was off, since that obviously makes a difference. But anyway, I like that point. I think it's a great point and an easy mistake to make, kind of as a business owner.
Now, there's some spy tools that you can use, like SimilarWeb is one that you can go ahead and see what they're doing and what channels and where the traffic is coming from. Are there any other tools that you use that might be very similar to a SimilarWeb that you find where you can really dive deep and figure out what's going on?
Yeah, so SimilarWeb would be a good one. I have a plugin for Chrome. I forget what it is, but I think it's called Wappalizer. Um,
Appleizer, huh?
Yeah, but you click on that if you add it to your, Google Chrome, and you click on it when you're on a website, it will tell you, kind of what kind of email marketing they're doing, what kind of, plugins they have and things like that. So kind of a combination of those tools. But yeah, but also, I mean, even, listening to podcasts, figuring it out. Really, at the end of the day, you want to make sure you're not kind of starting from scratch. But the question is, hey, these businesses that have been successful, what channels can we leverage those channels? But like I mentioned before, also make sure you're not spreading yourself too thin and you're not trying to do too many things. And as an example, I think sometimes people think that, I don't like YouTube as a channel, but I think YouTube is a fantastic channel. But if you're a new e-commerce brand and you're trying to decide between Instagram and YouTube, I would say focus on Instagram, get really, really, really good at Instagram. And once you have kind of a flywheel going there, you have a process going there, it can kind of run without you, which is, one of the things that you talked about. Then you could kind of move on and say, okay, how do we leverage YouTube in addition to Instagram? But personally, what I've seen is a lot of brands fail because they try to do YouTube and Instagram at the same time, and then neither get off the ground because they don't have kind of the time or the resources to perfect, the strategy on each one that they need to leverage those.
Yeah, absolutely. The other part that we haven't really touched about is when we look at the customer journey today, right? A lot of people, they tend to think like the marketing funnel exists the way, top, middle, bottom funnel, almost, the way everybody has been talking about it for God knows how many years. But what we know is that was actually built in the late 1800s, modified only one more time in 1924. And that's the same funnel that almost everybody is operating from. Then Google did a study and they realized that the funnel is actually a lot more messy. They start with some sort of trigger, maybe it's seeing one of your ads, and then they go through this cycle of exploration and evaluation before they make a decision. And in 2019, they went through that cycle 17 times. In 2021, it was 27 times. And then data recently is suggesting it could be as high as 36 times. So they're doing the research. Our buyers have become researchers. They want to make smart decisions. And that doesn't matter if you're buying a Rich wallet or you're buying agency services or whatever it is. This exists for every business across the board. In fact, it may even more serious when we talk to B2B companies, because 96% of all buying behavior happens before they get on the phone with somebody, right? So the first click is not necessarily what's going to bring home the bread and butter. And that's where a lot of people need to understand. It's the first click doesn't promise all the bread and butter. It's actually what is following that first click. That's where the money is actually made. What follows that? And there could be retargeting components of that. And then, Joe, where do you go beyond that first click?
So I love this point. definitely worth kind of discussing and considering. And specifically for the e-commerce brands we work with, one of the things I like to tell brand owners is, and again, everybody gets very focused on ROAS and they kind of think like this is the end all be all and this measures everything. But anyway, you have to kind of learn, how do you measure kind of beyond that? What does the business look like beyond that? What does the second purchase look like? What do the different touch points look like? With e-commerce as an example, I like to tell people the ROAS is kind of the minimum amount that you're driving from those ads, not maximum number. Anyway, and I think we get a little bit spoiled because you run a billboard campaign and you don't measure, every single purchase that comes from the billboard. You just realize, hey, we spent 2,000 on this and our revenue went up 10,000. And so we're a little bit spoiled when it comes to, meta ads and things like that. But I do think you can over measure it and over analyze it, and you miss kind of your opportunity to grow by doing so. And, to your point, let's say somebody sees an ad for a hat on Facebook and they share it with their wife or they share it with their mom, and their wife or their mom, they buy the hat for them as a gift. Well, that Facebook ad doesn't get credit for it, but because you're paying to be out there and you're getting in front of people, then, that purchase happened. Or, again, you get a hat on somebody's head when you pay whatever it is to acquire that customer, but then their friend or somebody at school sees them wearing the hat, or they're just driving down the street wearing the hat and they see it, they like it, they decide to go buy it because they found it. There's just a lot more going on with your ad spend than what you're able to measure, like you said, with that first click. And so that's just kind of one thing to look at. Another one that we try to do with, and a lot of people overlook this as well, and this is very e-commerce specific, but Facebook reports a 7-day kind of return on your ad spend typically, but you can actually expand that and you can look at a 28-day return on ad spend. So you can compare a 28-day clicks versus 1-day click or 7-day click. So one of the things that we do is we'll look at those numbers and we'll come up with a delayed attribution number where basically day one, your ROAS might be a 2, but over a 28-day period, it actually goes up to 2.5. And so, the number you're looking at every day, you think you're just getting into return, but the people who come back later, the people who, they saw it today, but they didn't buy until week 3, that kind of starts getting added back in. And again, that's just what's trackable. But it's important to know that, because if you're just measuring the first day, you're missing out on the benefit over those next 28 days. So it's hard to get into all the details now, but I just would say it is very important to make sure you're kind of considering those things and just measuring the kind of business impact overall, and kind of measuring so closely that you start missing out on opportunity because you're kind of a little bit too kind of micro focused.
Yeah.
That's just a mistake that you can make.
I get it. It is important that you just don't have one ad running, and you have that retargeting sequence in there, so they see the ads over and over and over again too. 'Cause that's part of how you both create, capture, nurture, demand. All part of that kind of fits in within retargeting, and we're buyers or researchers. That part is essential. I ask our listeners to think about how you do business, and if you think about it, like the majority of the business that you do, you may have seen an ad, you might have received an email, whatnot. You'll be thinking about it. And then there's something going to happen that you'll be like, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to invest in this. And then you're going to go to Google and you're either going to type in the company name or you're going to go right to the URL. In my book, The Predictable Profits Playbook, we refer to that as brand recall. And what we found is that there's actually a direct correlation between brand recall and revenue. And you can plot that. You can actually put it on a graph and you'll see that direct correlation. This ties into what you talked about, that it's very difficult to measure, but you could see a direct correlation that the brand recall continues to go up. And so I had this CEO of a company, they do, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year, that was asking me about that. And he goes, I don't know if that's necessarily true for my business. And I said, well, I like to talk about results. So why don't you just prove me wrong? And then we can continue the conversation. And then he sent me a screenshot and it was in fact true. Revenue and recall were direct lockstep. Now I know, Joe, we are pushing up against the clock and this is the Beyond Seven Figures. So my favorite question to ask my guests is, what is your best tip for the listeners who are saying, how do I take my business beyond 7 figures?
Yeah, this will be a little bit e-commerce focused, but I think there's the kind of lessons you can kind of apply elsewhere. But this is just kind of what I've learned and experienced with brands. And I would say the main thing is I think a lot of people think marketing is kind of the thing that holds you back. Personally, in my experience, I think marketing is the easy part, and maybe that's just because I'm a marketer. But more often than not, we're able to kind of figure out for e-commerce brands. The biggest thing that we have seen hold brands back is actually operations. We've seen multiple brands where we run the ads, we run the marketing, and then they run out of 8 of their top 10 best sellers because they're not tracking their inventory and they're not planning it, not kind of keeping products in stock. And then they turn to us and they say, "Hey, why have sales slow down? Why has marketing slowed down?" And we have to explain, "Hey, it's hard to get ads to run really well when 8 of the top 10 best sellers are out of stock. It's like the stuff people want they can't buy." So that's on the kind of more negative side. But with a brand that we grew from 6 to 8 figures in a year, I would say, and actually I would give them a lot of credit for this. They're the one brand we've worked with who was able to keep up operationally. So they kept track of their cash flow. They invested in inventory. They tracked their inventory. They kept stuff in stock, and that they were consistently dropping new products. So all of that combined kind of gave us the fuel to keep the fire. The ad strategy, ad buying, and the creative and all that stuff. We were able to do that to really pour gas fire and get things to take off. And anyway, I would again, I would just emphasize that the factor that helped them grow was being strong on the operational side and then partnering with somebody who's strong on the marketing side. I would say that's the difference between 7 and 8 figures.
Well, when we're talking about on the B2B side, I was speaking with somebody who was doing 20 mil. This was earlier today. They do $20 million a year and they want to invest more in marketing. But I actually told him, you aren't ready to invest more in marketing yet. So he looked at me, a little puzzled. I don't understand what you mean. We're not ready to invest in marketing. I said, because what's happening is when you look at the sales process right now, your sales process has a significant leak in it. You are losing deals. The team isn't following up when they actually should be following up. The pipeline has way too much guesswork. There's so much happening at the moment right now. You actually have the capacity to double the size of the business right now without having to spend more in marketing because of the consistent flow of organic leads that you're already getting right now, but are being lost through the sales process. And this is what ties in when you're talking about operationally. Guesswork is a cancer of all business. So where are you currently having guesswork in the business? Put some numbers on it, get the right systems and processes in place. You have the right systems or right processes, you remove the guesswork, scaling becomes a heck of a lot easier. You find an ad, like in your case, that works. Go, you know what? Let's up the budget. Let's up the budget. Let's up the budget. Keep going. You can do that confidently when you know that everything is working there on the back end. Now, Joe, people want to learn more about you and Conversion Engine and follow along with some of the resources that you put out there. Where do we send them?
Yeah, so best place is to go to conversionengine.com. So that's the website. Find whatever you need there about Conversion Engine. And then for me personally, Twitter probably is the best place to go. So I'm at Joseph Putnam on Twitter and then LinkedIn. So if you want to come find me on LinkedIn, I'm happy to connect with them there as well.
Awesome. Fantastic, man. I appreciate that. So, wow, we talked about a lot of stuff, even though we largely talked about e-com businesses. I hope you listen to the ways that it can also support you from if you're in consumer services, if you're in B2B, if you're agency, and so forth. It's an abundant amount of opportunities. We shouldn't be asking ourselves, does this apply to me? We should be asking ourselves a different question. How does this actually apply to me? And, we also reference this idea that everything works and nothing works all at the same time, right? Joe talked about simplification and really focus in and hone in on one particular platform and make that work for you. Collect the data so you know exactly what's working and then what's not working within that. And that makes it a lot easier for you to optimize. So we covered a lot. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Joe's from conversionengine.com, so make sure you check him out. And also for those of you who are listening saying, how do I grow my business faster, more predictably, and less dependent on me? Check us out at predictableprofits.com. Again, that's predictableprofits.com. Got a bunch of resources in there for you as well. So check it out. This is Charles Cadet with my new friend, Joe Putnam, and I will see you in another episode.